For those of you who don't know us, Friends of the Cam was set up 15 months ago to publicise and challenge current threats to our ecologically rare chalk streams and to the Fens, precious watery environments in the driest part of the country. When I first read Imperial Mud, recommended by a friend who lives in a fen village just outside Ely, I was struck by the parallels between the 17th century enclosures, which championed technology and growth above the livelihoods of local people, and the present day. Politicians of all stripes still laud growth as inevitable and progressive, and privileged the demands and voices of the wealthy, the developers, significant landowners and property investors, over residents of the city and the county towns and villages of the area. These residents can't afford the upwardly spiralling house prices which development accelerates. This growth discourse normalises the spending, for example, of upwards of £30 billion to relocate one of the few well-functioning sewage works inconveniently located near Cambridge's New North Station to greenbelt land, which is permeable to the chalk aquifer, just so that 5,000 or so housing units can be built by mostly speculative housing developers. And these developers are frequently found marketing their properties to Chinese investors. But James's book, and I imagine talk tonight, gives us hope. He resurrects the Fen men and women, and I'm impressed by just how many women were involved in the resistances, who held off enclosures longer than elsewhere in England. He also rescues them from the caricatures of who he calls the Fenish, who were deliberately propagandized by the developers of the day and their supporters as like savages, fish, hogs, and as rude, uncivil, and lazy. Draining the marsh, on the other hand, was seen as God's work. James has earned an international reputation and many awards as an historian of colonialism and its social and ecological effects, whether at home as the colonial power and its own people, or exported. And most of his books relate to the colonial appropriation of Australia. He writes as if history really does belong to us all, and we have enormous pleasure in welcoming James tonight and hearing him talk about his work on the Fens. So over to you, James, and thank you again so much.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for joining in. It's wonderful. There's so many of you, and it's a great honour for me. And those words you just said, Susan, were very important for me. I mean, I think the biggest hope I had in writing the book, of course, as a historian, we engage with history as it is. I mean, it's important not to write out of any contemporary agenda, but to try and understand the people of the past and to try and hear their story and to try to hear the story of ordinary people has always been very important to me. But I did harbour a hope that for those fighting for our precious planet today and the beautiful part of the world that is the Fens, that it would give, the book would give the word you used and the word that's most important for me, hope. And so you saying that, Susan, means a lot. And the fact that the Friends of the Cam and others of you who are joining in today who, of course, know the Fens so much better than me because it's your home. The fact that if the book can give encouragement and strength and connection, that means more than any other praise I could receive. So thank you, and thank you all for joining in. I think I should just ground myself. I mean, Susan did mention that I'm speaking from Australia, and no doubt you noticed I'm speaking funny. And it's actually, I can tell you that it's you can look forward to Thursday. It's a beautiful morning, so you don't have to worry about Thursday. It's Thursday morning here. I love the beautiful morning in Hobart, which is the southernmost capital city in Australia. It's the island state of Tasmania, which is off the southern coast of Australia. It's not a small island as people often think. It's about the same size as Ireland. It just looks small when you compare it with the big island to the north. And we used to be called, its imperial name was Van Diemen's Land, which if you were a 19th century Briton, and a 19th century Fen man or woman, especially if you're engaged in some form of protest, you would have heard of, because it was the notorious penal colony. About half of the convicts who were sent to Australia came to this island, around 72,000 in all, and in the first half of the 19th century. So it's the sort of convict legacy, the legacy of protest in Britain, the punishment that hung over the working class and the rural poor of Britain and Ireland in the early 19th century was to be sent to Van Diemen's Land. In fact, there was a piece of social research done as late as the 1930s in the East End of London, and working class women were still threatening their children that if they didn't behave themselves properly, they'd be sent to Van Diemen's Land. And of course, no one at that point had any idea what Van Diemen's Land was, but it had just entered the culture to that point. And Van Diemen's Land, after the end of convict transportation, was renamed Tasmania, and that's where I'm speaking to you from today. And it's quite legitimate for you to be up to ask why a fellow from Van Diemen's Land would want to talk to you about the history of a distant place, which you know so much better than me. And I will return to that legitimate question later. But first, I want to acknowledge it's a tradition in Australia to start doing this, to make some acknowledgement to country, to the people who are the local people who are the custodians of that country. And I want to acknowledge your custodianship and care for what in Australia we are increasingly terming country. It's a term that doesn't mean the nation state anymore, or or sort of just a concept. It means a particular piece of land, but also all the connections and belonging and relationships which go with that piece of land. So this term country, which is coming into general use, and of course it's come to us as a gift from Aboriginal people, but it has a much deeper association with the land. And I suggest it's the sort of association I'm talking about in the book with the local people of the Fens. This is their country, not just a piece of land that they happen to live on, but they have these deep relationships and connection to it. And so, and I'm as a writer of the history of the Fens, I'm just someone who loves the Fens, but doesn't live there. I just want to acknowledge your care for country, being expressed in the inspiring work being done by the Friends of the Cam in particular, which I've looked up and read about and inspired, and in return have also received hope from. So thank you for that. And secondly, before I begin, so that there's no sort of misunderstandings of this, I want to acknowledge also that the most urgent task of historians across the Western world, I mean, whether it be in Australia or Britain or North America, over the past few decades, has been to face up to the full truth of our past. The reality for all human beings, not just the powerful white men, of what empire meant, what industrialisation meant, colonisation, and so on and so on. So, the impact on women, the impact on the poor, the impact on all the people that don't readily make it into the archives, the silences in the archives, dig deeper into history and to try and find those, and of course, Indigenous people as well. It's been a momentous time the last few centuries, absolutely extraordinary period in history, and especially the impact of the Western world on nature and on other countries. And this is such a extraordinary period, and we know the depth of suffering and destruction, but also of creativity, also of freedom. It's a time that we have to enter into a great deal of care and respect, but also acknowledgement of the suffering and death that is brought in that's been part of this process and the destruction of so many cultures around the world. And part of the rewriting of the history has to be, we have to acknowledge from the beginning, if we're to listen to all the nuances and all the other things that have gone on, that we have to acknowledge the terrible harm done to not just to Indigenous people, but also to the natural world, to non-human life. It has been underpinned not just by institutions and economic systems, but by ideas. And some of which ideas have been liberating in other respects. It's not a straightforward story, but this has caused, as you know, as we live day by day, the consequences of a profound gulf to open up between the way we live and the capacities of the earth to sustain this. So having said that, a major concern of mine, though, remains that much otherwise valuable environmental history that's been written, the past has been reduced to only being a problem to be overcome. I mean, this is the other danger. The past becomes just a place of despair. And environmental history that documents the destruction and the harm that we've done to nature and the destructive attitudes Western people have can easily lead to the conclusion, even if it's not explicit, it's something that people take on board, that our only hope is to reject all this destructive cultural heritage and, in a sense, start all over again. And what I'd suggest is, one, that that's not actually possible. But even if it was, we all carry within us this inheritance. So it's no more possible to reject past in our culture than it is to reject our own family of origin, in terms of their impact on us. I don't want to see them or talk to them anymore in the worst case scenarios. But you're never free. You're never free. We need to talk to the people of the past. And without that, this modern idea of just rejection of attitudes of the past, it makes us adds to our loneliness. Given the urgency of the environmental crisis, we actually need companionship. We need diverse sources of wisdom. We need new form systems of knowledge and connection, everyone we can find. And it's too often forgotten that we actually haven't been a modern people for all that long. And even during recent centuries, when the time of modernity, the past is not just one place, and the Western inheritance is not just one experience. The truth is that Western environmental history, and local Fens history in particular, is a messy, contested place where there is much we can learn and draw strength from. And engaging with the fullness of people's relationships with the land over time can really open up our imagination as much as shut them down. It can provide us with hope as much as despair. So when we dig deep into any particular piece of earth on the planet, but I'd suggest your bit of earth in particular, because the traditional ties to the land persisted for so long, we will find, actually, unsurprisingly, human beings in the fullness. We sometimes forget that people of the past are human beings like us. It's a very obvious statement, but it's one that's surprisingly often forgotten. They're people who cared about their families, people who cared about their communities, their livelihoods and their home. And when these were threatened, unsurprisingly, they, as many of you are doing now, acted to defend them. But to connect with this tradition, and it's extraordinary tradition of defence for the Fens. I mean, you're in you're inheriting, standing in the footsteps of generations of care for country. This tradition of defending the Fens, its country, and its way of life. Before we can fully engage with that, our task, a bit like this. Same as when we travel to a foreign land today, is to face the reality of cultural difference. These are fully human beings like us, but there is also a different culture. And to have a communication, to learn from them, to understand their way of caring for the land and what the land meant for them, we do need to engage with cultural difference, not assume they're just like us. And the most critical difference that we've got to deal with at the beginning is to understand that most of this bountiful wetland that was the Fens was common land, and most of its people were commoners. And as I say in Imperial Mud, the book, in my book, the consciousness of the commoners, their worldview, how they see the world, what they just take for granted, their sort of common sense, if you like, understanding, it's almost as different from those of contemporary Western people, from our modern minds, as that of Aboriginal people is, but in my own country today. It really is it's a very different way of experiencing life. What we so take for granted, and the essence of this, what we so take for granted that we rarely reflect on it, and even if we do, we find it hard to imagine any other way of being, is the assumption that each of us is an individual with an identity distinct from our community and the earth on which we live. That we're all sort of separate people. We might live in a particular place, but our identity is separate from that place and separate from the other people who live there. Now, for a commoner, it's a different way of experiencing the world and the country in which they live. Now, look, I'm not criticising the modern where we sit. This is not some condemnation of the modern Western mind, because this individuality comes with benefits as well as costs. But just pointing out to you that commoners don't have that sharp boundary between how they understand themselves and their relationship to the environment and their relationship to each other. So that the commons is actually about relationships. It's not about some legal codified set of rights and responsibilities of. Relationships with self, country, and other people are bound together. And it's also important to know that, contrary to a lot of commentary that you get, just sort of casual commentary in media and like, the English commons were not primarily unowned land. We're not just talking about sort of empty land that no one owns here, nor are they, as I mentioned before, just a set of rights to access the resources of the land. So in later periods and through to the present day, common rights have had to be codified in law. The right to get some recognition from parliaments and courts. But in its essence, the commons was about deeply ingrained customary relationships with the natural world and with other local people. So having said that, that's really important to have in our minds. And the other thing that we need to sort of engage with, of course, is the landscape itself, because, as you know, it's a very much a transformed landscape, the modern Fens. And it's sad, really, isn't it, that the very end of the old Fens, which is perhaps marked by the draining of Whittlesea Mere in the early 1850s, where the Victorians believed they'd completed the drainage. I mean, that turned out to be another case of imperial arrogance. But that was lost before photography was developed. It wouldn't have been wonderful to see some photos of it. And even artists were only just beginning to appreciate such landscapes. So even the amount of art we have is limited. And this makes it hard to imagine what has been lost, especially as most of the words, as Susan alluded before, it wasn't just the Fenish, or, as I refer to that culture and that people, but it wasn't just the people of the Fens who were denigrated by those who wanted to drain the land, but it was also the country. It's turned into, even today, we carry sort of negative associations with the word swamp. It's unhealthy, and of course there was malaria, which was quite helpful to the local people, by the way, because they had a level of resistance to it, and helped keep others out. But this was sort of, they believed the air itself, was polluted in these wetlands. Which related to the understanding of sickness at the time. In fact, it was quite a healthy place to be, from what we know, people people had life expectancies way beyond they were having in the cities, I can assure you. But the words written about the Fens were largely written by those seeking to justify to drain it, to improve it in their language. So we've got to open our imaginations to what it was like, and we can, it's still the potential to do that. And of course, you've got access to remnants of the old country. Many of you will live, for example, quite near Wicken Fen, one of the oldest nature reserves in Britain that goes back to the end of the 19th century, managed by the National Trust, and there are other small remnants. But these fragments, the problem is these fragments only provide glimpses, because the whole is so much bigger than the sum of its parts. They're interconnected. So these little islands that are left really don't give us an idea of well, it's hard. We really have to open our imaginations up to imagine the sheer glory of the old Fen. But look, I won't talk too much on that. But I'll just to open that, if you'd excuse me, I'll just read the opening paragraph of my book, Imperial Mud. There it is, if anyone hasn't seen it. A little bit of a plug. Just so we can get into, just to help us get into our idea of what the rivers were like, what this country in its undrained state, what we're talking about. And the rivers are not like the rivers that we see today. Perhaps, here we go. Anyway, I'll read the first paragraph. Until a few hundred years ago, the rivers that flowed from central England to the North Sea metamorphosed into a wetland wilderness as they approached the Wash. Encouraged by low gradient and high sediment, they broke their banks to meander into countless and ever-changing channels, forming vast reed-covered fens, shallow bird-friendly lakes, and nutrient-rich summer meadows, more akin to the Amazonian delta than the ordered agricultural landscape that the Fens have now become. So the key is not just the seasonal changes as the waters came and went, but the fact that the rivers broke their banks and meandered into these ever-changing waterways that quite often change their paths year on year. It was an ever-changing, evolving landscape. And now we just to go on to the remaking of the Fens and the resistance to that. There were two projects that were closely linked. There was the engineering project called drainage and the privatisation project called enclosure. And the two are linked because they depended on each other. To raise the money for drainage, and it was considerable, this is a large-scale capital project, they need a lot of money and they need a return on that money. And the private investors who put the money into these drainage schemes got their return from enclosure. Now, enclosure involved removing the end of the common, the removal of all these ancient customary rights and essentially privatising the drained land. So enclosure turns it into what we understand as private property today. It's about, I have access to the resource. The resources are mine. I control access to the land. Other people who come onto the land without permission are trespassers. If you want to fish on my land, if you want to hunt on my, you need my permission. If you want to gather fuel, because I own the land. This is the modern notion of land ownership. Now, where I said before that the commons isn't about who owns the land was owned by someone before. There was a landowner. All of England was owned by somebody. It wasn't, even if it was the monarch. So it's at least since Norman times. But the common rights were these customary rights that continued. That you had the right to access fuel. Local people would have rights that had time out of mind was the term. They were customary rights that did have a certain legal basis. to gather fuel, gather reeds, gather food. And of course, the Fens common rights were extensive. And so enclosure is not about just about planting hedgerows or fencing fields, nor is it just primarily about who owns it. It's ending these old customary common practices governing the use of the land. It guided what were communal rules over its access and use of its resources. And in the Fens, there's immense natural resources, the wildlife, the fish, the birds, the eels, the fuel, the peat, pastures, these rich summer pastures fertilised every year by the waters, you see reeds, as well, and the domestic stock, geese, etc., etc. We're reliant on the common and get the use governed by these communal customary relationships, all of which are removed with enclosure, where it becomes tenant farmers are put in, paying rent. The modern idea of land ownership is. Sometimes this was done by so-called voluntary agreements between the landowners and the commoners, but more often it was, especially in later years, an act of parliament was required. And there were thousands of acts of parliament, in the 1700s and 1800s, which extinguished all the common rights. After enclosure, the new owner did not just own the land, but it exclusively controlled access to it. Anyone who entered now needed permission. Anyone who sought to access its wealth had to pay for the privilege. In short, trespassers could now be prosecuted, and often were. But as I alluded to, I'll just skip that bit. To understand the depth of enclosure, what enclosure meant for local people, when go back to that idea I was talking about at the very beginning, what the land meant to the local people. So it's not just they lost access to the wealth of the land, which is their social security system, all the traditions and customs that cared for it, that reproduced in the community. Now they were totally dependent on wage labour to survive, where paid work was not sufficient to live off. Dispossessed commoners had to seek work in the cities, in industrialisation, they moved to the cities, or they became part of the great migrations that in turn dispossessed other people across the empire. The great tragedy of imperial history is these dispossessed commoners become the dispossessors in countries like Australia, and New Zealand, and Canada, and the United States. Some resorted to crime, including to the right to hunt and fish on country. The reason that poaching is not considered a crime by the courts, but amongst local people, it was never really understood as a crime, because they remembered what had been lost. This privatisation of the wild animals was never accepted by local people. But now it was deemed poaching. And of course, there's plenty of poachers that ended up in places like Van Diemen's Land. And to get what is lost, let's just imagine, go back to remembering what country meant. It is the right to graze cattle and geese. It is the right to collect fuel. It's the right to fish, to hunt, to gather eggs, harvest rushes. All the essentials of life are involved. But it's also a way of being in the world. People became homeless in a spiritual, sense, as well as a literal sense. This wetland was not just a resource to commoners, it was integral to who they were. And so their land is not only being enclosed, their land is being transformed, being destroyed. And it must have been even harder for local people to imagine a world without that wetland. This is the only world they'd ever known. This was their universe. This was their Earth, their planet. As it is now for us to imagine a world with this wetland. The extent of their loss when they lost their country is almost Now, I mean, I was listening to a radio. I was telling Emma, my wife, just incredibly moving. You'd probably be able to hear it on ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission's site. There's a podcast. It's called Away, which is an Indigenous radio show they have on each week. And they were talking about, they were interviewing a couple of elderly Aboriginal people who were the last survivors of one of the last big removal of Aboriginal people in coastal Australia that occurred after the second. As late as the 1940s, it was a remote island in the Gulf of Carpentaria off northern Australia. And these people were removed. I think it was in the context of concern about the Japanese, but it was, part of the long history of the colonial project, and taken to a bigger island, Mornington Island, where the children were put in dormitories and separated from their parents and separated from, the boys in one dormitory, girls in another. And terribly tragic story. And now these elderly people, this granddaughter took her grandmother back to the island of her birth. And the cry of lament, the anguish that you can even hear over the radio, what the loss of her home meant, just goes through, went through my being. And of course, the Indigenous people of this island, my home, were removed to an island in Bass Strait. The last survivors at the end of the period of conflict were also removed. And they noted in the radio document in this interview that no children were born for 10 years after the removal. They don't know why. There's no medical reason. There were plenty of women of childbearing age, but it was just the sheer level of grief at the loss of their home. And when they go back and they're naming this island, which is now uninhabited and still very remote, and it was so remote, it wasn't visited regularly even by other Aboriginal people. What the name for this island, the Aboriginal name for this island, we think of that as a name for an island. That's the name for that island. This name it translates much more as the name of the world. It's the island. It's not the name of an island, because of course they've got no notion of it being an island. This is their universe. This is their place. This is their earth. And I suggest it's a bit like that for the people of the Fens. Did not travel off on big sojourn trips all over. This was their world. And this world was totally being destroyed and transformed. And the trauma of that is not just measured by loss of common rights in some legal sense, or can just be compensated for by enclosure commissioners. So when the King's contractors, the Stuart Kings, who sort of led the drainage charge in the 17th century, appeared with their legal documents and detailed plans to drain what they called the Great Level in Cambridgeshire in the 1620s. The Great Level was a vast region of 300,000 acres, encompassing much of northern Cambridgeshire and western Norfolk. And the local people must have initially had as little idea as what that would really mean for them as the Indigenous people of Australia, New Zealand or North America had, when white men came with other pieces of paper which purportedly proved that they now owned the land. And look, I won't go into tonight because I want to have time for a chat, but the often remarkable engineering works involved in the draining of the Fens. Some of you will know about those schemes, and we can still see. I mean, some of the 17th century works still evident today. Or the intrigues involving a cash-hungry port, up investors, which underpinned those first ambitious projects in the early 17th century. I write about this history in Imperial Mud, and would also commend recent books by Eric Ash and Ian Rotherham, as well as older works by a remarkable, humble and insufficiently celebrated scholar at Cambridge, Joan Fersk. And I think if Joan had been a man, I think she would be much better remembered today. And I try and acknowledge Jane in my book and mention her again today. I mean, she's for many years, but her scholarship is really the basis on which I drew on and many others have drawn on. But those of you involved in local struggles today, fighting what can still be the cosy partnership between developers and the state, might find some disturbing themes that reverberate since the 17th century. This was a partnership between the institute government and the developers and the landowners. It was actually the state was a key player in this as well. I just want to point out to you now, for those who haven't read the book, that there's no evidence that the drainage and enclosure of the Great Level was some national policy attempt to increase output and wealth, or to control floodwaters in the interests of community safety. The question was not whether, I mean, these questions of the outcome of drainage, whether it increased economic output, etc., they can be legitimately debated. But my point is that the motivation was not the common good, but quite clearly private gains. Nor is it a case that there is any clarity that the lost fen was less productive than what replaced it. This was not a poor region of England. You all know better than me the grandeur of the ruined monasteries, you know, the churches that are still there, and the beautiful villages. They attest to how much wealth was produced. This is one of the wealthiest areas of England in the medieval period. Some of the wealth of the Cambridge colleges can be traced back to the abundance of the fen. And such was the commonwealth that it secured a level of decency for the common people, even after their tithes and their taxes were paid. And the importance of the common to women in particular has now been well studied, and it's perhaps not surprising that, as Susan mentioned, women were often active leaders and organisers of the resistance to drainage and enclosure. I mean, they were leaders often active around England in resisting enclosure, often played a leading part. But in the Fens, it's really quite remarkable how often they figure and are organising and leading village resistance. And I don't just mean backroom organisers often standing at the front line with forks and pitchforks and being part of the direct action as well. So much did the wetlands define the commoners' world that no doubt it was only when the waters receded and the commoners were defined as trespassers in their own country for simply doing what they and their ancestors had always done, that the reality sunk into what enclosure and drainage really meant. Homelessness, dependence, a poverty and a grief which pervaded their being. And so it's not surprising that almost as soon as the drainage started, the fight back began. The first documented casualty of the conflict occurred in 1628 when a commoner was killed by one of the contracted Dutch drainage workers as he sought to obstruct their works. There would be many more. Armed resistance and direct action involving destruction of the draining works became widespread, both before and after the drainage of the Great Level was deemed complete in 1636. In the coming decades, dozens of people were injured or died, scores were exiled or heavily fined, hundreds imprisoned for varying periods. Again, I won't go into the full detail of the resistance today, but I do want to point out how multifaceted it was. I've learned in studying convict history and the colonial frontier and the survival of Aboriginal people through the first decades of imperial conquest, that resistance can take many forms, and most of these were on display in the fight for the Fens. Now, this sort of multifaceted nature of resistance is true across the empire, and as you might have gathered, I see the enclosure of the Fens as part of the wider imperial project. But being English did bring its advantages, of course. There was more ready use of courts and petitions to Parliament for a start. Many of these strategies you would be familiar with today. But a big difference at the time is that the central government did not yet have complete control over its instruments of state. The central government was still asserting its power. It still had a way to go before it was the modern, centralised, powerful state that we know today. There was not yet a standing army in England or a police force. And law and order still relied on local justices and local constables and local juries. And their loyalties could be split, and often were. And so that was part of the nature of the sometimes successful local resistance. Where there was communal solidarity, as there so often was, it could be difficult to prosecute those involved in direct action. A lot of products were traded. We're not just talking about some sort of small, like is often presented by the denigrators as if it produced nothing. It was just about subsistence life. But these people, people living a traditional life, were trading all sorts of products. You know, probably some of you will have heard about, you know, the hundreds of thousands of eels supplied to Ely Cathedral, for example, in Tyres, but all sorts of products, cattle, geese, down, game, would find their way to London markets or other markets. And so there were merchants involved in the defence of the common as well. There were some surprising allies. You know, it's not all, and again, that you would find today. It's it's not always straightforward whose side people would be on in this fight. There were many people making money, making their livelihood from the old common who lived, say, in Boston. So the story of the resistance is full of drama and full of sort of competing, you know, politics is at its heart as well. And it soon gets very closely tied up in the Civil War, and the drama escalates. And Oliver Cromwell, as many of you know, was a Fen from the Fens. And while he initially gave voice to the commoners' grievances in gaining parliamentary and popular support, still all right? Still hear me okay, Susan? Oh, good. Just, yeah, my screen's doing funny things, but I'll ignore that. And so it was unfortunate, though, for the people of the Great Level that its major investors, the beneficiaries of enclosure, turned out to be parliamentary men. So it was seasoned parliamentary troops who in the 1650s forcefully crushed what had become a highly successful resistance. So during the 1640s, most of the common land had been reclaimed, the wetland restored, these drainage works destroyed, many new farmhouses wiped from the face, even a new village or two destroyed. But Cromwell used his experienced cavalry, seasoned warriors, to reassert control in the 1650s. But in the vast wetlands from Boston in southern Lincolnshire, it was a different story, because there the enclosures were on the side of the king. So the destruction of the drainage works there that had gone on in the chaos of the 1640s during the time of the Civil War, there it was allowed to remain, and the wetland came back and the common was restored. So politics can be an unpredictable business, as I'm sure many of you know. Its factions and conflicts can help as well as hinder, often in surprising ways. And so comprehensive was the commoners' victory in Lincolnshire, and so nervous did the future investors become at the risk of losing capital should future schemes be pursued. There was to be 120 years before the drainage and enclosure was again seriously pursued. Now, I think we might call that a victory, eh? That was 120 years. They destroyed the old drainage works, they restored the wetland and the common. And it wasn't until the 1760s and 70s that drainage was again pursued in that region. And now the fight was particularly brutal. By the 1760s and 70s, the commoners knew what they were fighting for, and they were inspired by the victories of their ancestors. They knew the loss of what enclosure meant in other regions of the Fens. But by the late 18th century, the state had become far more powerful beast than the one of the mid-17th century. Strategy was also more carefully thought through. A new standing army, Scotch Greys in particular were used. Parliament was used to make laws. The courts upheld those, and constables now did what they were told. Commoners were deliberately divided, whole communities were punished. When resistance occurred, they were collectively punished, as Indigenous people were being around the empire, no longer just the offender being sought out, but the whole community punished. Crushing fines and a range of new harsh punishments available under, the notorious Black Act and other legislation, very severe penalties, these were imposed. It was a brutal enclosure that made the one of the century before look relatively benign. But even in this punitive context, resistance achieved significant concessions. The Isle of Axum provides the best case in point. I follow Ian Rotherman and others, including this part of northern Lincolnshire and western Yorkshire in the Fens, because the drainage and enclosure of its wetlands was so closely related to the process in the south. There too, in the 1650s, drainage was destroyed, the new settler village of Sandhurst was flattened, and its mostly French Huguenot tenant farmers were evicted. There can be unsurprisingly, I suppose, there is a dark side, of course, to localism, and these French Huguenot refugees were often the victims. They were brought in as the tenant farmers, the settler farmers, as part of this colonial project on the drained land. They would become the new tenant farmers because the local people largely didn't have the money or the will for this way of life. But these they were often bore their homes could be destroyed and flattened. In Sandhurst, even their church was destroyed. But this powerful organised resistance, so in the Isle, the wetland was also reclaimed in the 1650s, and there was a remarkable and sustained unity of purpose in this part of the world, and that defeated all attempts at enclosure throughout the 17th and 18th century. If you were brought up as a good Methodist before the war, you would probably have been told the story of the infant John Wesley, who, the founder of Methodism, of course, who came from the Isle, he came from the village of Epworth. And there was a story that became part of Methodist folklore where John was just 2 or 3 years old. The vicarage was burning down and he was stuck in the middle of the night. He was stuck up on the 2nd floor and seemed destined to die, but was miraculously rescued. And this was seen as a sign from God of what John was to do with his life. What's not told in myth is that the vicarage was burning down almost certainly. It was because John's dad, the Reverend Samuel Wesley, was closely allied to the enclosing landlords. Which reminds me of yet another way that resistance occurred. Hardly anyone in Epworth or surrounding villages, or indeed in many other parts of the Fen, went to church. Because in most parishes, but by no means all, the Church of England was allied to the enclosing landlords. And, so at a time when by law you're meant to go to church, the attendances in Epworth, he's getting less 20 people on a Sunday out of 1,000 odd people. Instead, people built their own chapels. And across much of the region, dissenting and non-conformist churches came to dominate us. Many of those churches have now gone too. They were just little chapels. They weren't sort of built like the village parish churches to last for centuries. So while much of the Isle was eventually enclosed, the process was never fully completed. And so many concessions were won that even to this day, smallholders continue to flourish there, or well into the 20th century anyway, until some of the modern market problems. And even today, if you want to see open fields in England, one of the very few places you can see them is around Epworth, and that's a legacy of those centuries of struggle. If any of you want to read a romantic old novel about this remarkable resistance, I suggest John Hamilton's 19th century book, Manuscript in a Red Box. It's not a great piece of literature, but it gives you, it gives some colour to this period. Now, I emphasise the successes enjoyed by the resistance to drainage and closure because it's so important that we confront a contemporary mindset which can be found even among many people working to save and restore our planet. And that's a determinist perspective on the past, which can ferment despair about the future. Too often we start history from the reality of the present and work backwards from there to explain the tragedy of what's happened. Oh, look at where we've got to. Look at the Fens. We see a largely drained, largely destroyed ecosystem, and we assume this was the inevitable product of the past. Largely, unconsciously, our history becomes determinist. That is, what is had to be. There was always going to be like that. When the technology was there, it was always going to be used. Money was always going to win out. Of course, if there was money to be made from drainage, of course the drainage was there. And the resistance might have been a good thing to do, but of course they were going to lose. The determinist set that assumes it couldn't have been any other way. And when we see the past like that, it's very hard to see the future in any other way too. However hard we try, big money, big coal, big oil, big agribusiness, big banks, big corporations, big institutions, big government, and sheer greed will always win out in the end. And that sort of thinking can pervade our history. And it comes from a way of understanding history. But our imagination as to what is possible, what is realistic to achieve, becomes constrained by our straitjacket view of the reality of the past. This sort of history is not empirical because it does not begin in the past but the present. It misses the fact that there were always different choices and possibilities, different realities existed at the time, and many sometimes contradictory outcomes were achieved. History was not predetermined. Vested interests were real, power, profit, corrupt decision makers and self-interested developers were real then as they are now, but they were not the only forces at play, and they themselves were not always united or their influence straightforward or clear. Policy choices, and I emphasise the word choices, were made and taken. And these policy choices were made by real human beings. And resistance has been a real factor in the mix. It really has mattered in this complex, messy business called human history. So it's very important that we don't fall for a view of history which benefits no one but those who profit by destruction, by ceding them unhindered power. We need our eyes open to the reality of what went on, avoid just simply pitying the commoners or seeing the heroic resistance of the Fen as inherently futile. It's simplistic and dangerous to assume, so much history is done, that those who sought to drain and enclose the Fen were always going to unambiguously win out because history was somehow on their side. I hope in Imperial Mud that I showed that history was not as straightforward as this. Drainage delayed for generations was as much a victory as a loss. Time could change a lot. Then as of now, it allowed and facilitated adaptation, accommodation and change. It provided people and indeed birds and animals time to sometimes respond in highly creative ways. If your predecessors, for example, blocked a destructive development in one part of the CAM a generation ago, but another project was now to be approved, that doesn't mean that the resistance was futile. The current reality has been changed by that historical reality. All that happened in the interlude is now part of history and influencing the present. Winning time is always critical. It provides space for all sorts of unpredictable opportunities. Determinist history sidelines the subversive power of ordinary people to influence events, and it also ignores the subversive power of nature. Now, just having a look at the time, we're going to run out of conversation time, so I better jump on, because the rest of what I was going to talk about, and maybe we can cover it, is really that nature itself became part of the resistance. As many of you know, the Dutch engineers proved victory over the waters proved short-lived because the peat didn't behave as the Dutch victor would. Peat, when it's exposed to the air, so starts to decompose and starts to subside. So the earth sinks, and the more successful the drainage is, the more rapid the subsidence, and the harder the problem to keep it dry becomes. And so the original schemes, which really just relied on gravity to feed the water, soon became, didn't work, because, you know, everyone knows that water doesn't flow uphill. And so they had to bring in windmills. But through the 18th century, it was proving too much even for the windmills. They had to start leaving part of the areas wet for long periods so that the peat would replenish. But even so, by the early 19th century, there were serious questions where the large areas of fens would have to be fully abandoned. And it was only the coming of steam power in the early 19th century which seemed to ensure the success of the drainage of the fens. But even then, the old problem remained. The old dilemma that's never been solved: the more successful the drainage, the bigger the problem, the more rapid the loss of the peat is. And as you know, you can witness in the fens today, much of the agricultural country is now far below sea level. And while the big powerful steam engines of the mid-19th century secured a triumph for a period, by the late 19th century, the situation was already changing again, because the advent, ironically, of wheat from the Empire and from North America in particular, and steam transport, rapid transport and railways, meant that much of this country wasn't generating much of a profit anymore. The big investors withdrew. Smallholders based on more local markets moved in. But again, many areas were abandoned to the wetland. And it really, the period, the first half of the 20th century was actually much traditional ways of life, smallholders and restoration of wetland because of economics, in a sense, was quite paramount. And it wasn't so up really until the 1940s, and the pressure of the Second World War for food shortages meant that these areas were moved into again. But you can see again the paradoxical note. This is not sort of a straightforward story. We have at the Second World War, the previous 50 years, in many ways, seen a revival of traditional culture, traditional connections to land, smallholder farming, much areas of the wetland being restored. It's the fens that we see today is as much a product of the last four decades after the end of the Second World War as the 400 years before. There were big drainage, big engineering works in the 1950s, as you know, many honourably pursued as a response to the disastrous flooding of the floods that occurred at the time. And then we have modern industrial scale agriculture, subsidised by the entry to the European Union, and these last many areas of remnant wetland and big engineering works and big drainage works come into play. But the 21st century, which, to get to our present age, the old dilemma still there, that the land, the loss of the peat, not only is the land continuing to subside in those areas, which requires ever more expensive energy costs to keep it dry, but the productivity of the soil declines with the loss of the peat as well, so the return gets less. And we also have into the mix, of course, rising sea levels. So there's many people now, not just environmentalists in the old sense, but many farmers and land managers, government authorities, open to new ways of learning to live with the waters.
I think that's a great place, actually, James, if you're...
Yeah, let's get some questions.
Kind of been keeping an eye on the chat, and what you've been saying is clearly sparking a lot of interest. And one group of questions is about the kind of analogies of Fenland, what happened in the Fens to other places, so the Highland clearances, to the to Alaska, to Australia, but also a few people have asked about climate and climate refugees, and the idea that that there are large-scale clearances now because of what's happening to the weather and to the land.
Could I ask a question, Peter?
Yes.
Sorry, I've just written a book where I refer a lot to or Land Renewed.
Yeah.
Does James think that by accident, if not by design, with sea levels likely to rise by, say, a metre at least by the end of this century, and with sea defences incredibly fragile anyway, that we're going to see massive inundation in the Fens? And the alarming prospect to me is that while on the one hand, they are fairly, important in terms of food self-sufficiency in Britain, on the other, there's no sign of any resilience strategy on the part of the government on what to do if, say, we do get this large-scale inundation. Nothing in the new Agriculture Act that addresses that. All about biodiversity, fine, really important, but nothing about working in harmony with nature to try and increase our level of food production, say, in areas away from the Fens. Strikes me as a big problem, this.
Yeah. And it's nice to meet you, Peter, face to face. We've had email contact. But yeah, I'd defer. But can you just show your book again, Peter? So, because many people will be interested in it. I think Peter's got a new book out which talks about this central question of food. How we're going to work in the countryside in a way to sustain sustainable food production in the context of the rapid climate change and other environmental threats. And it's not an area I know a lot about, except to say that clearly in the Fens, the old model cannot work. And I think many farmers are admitting that now. It doesn't take it should be evident really to anybody when you walk through some of that rich industrial farming, and you look up meters above your head to where the waters, what were the old rivers, that essentially canals are taking the water to the sea, and the amount of energy cost involved in pumping that water and keeping, to produce that food. I mean, it's sustainable. And as the peat that seemed unlimited, it seemed to be a resource that could go on forever. And I mean, it's meters and meters and meters deep, but in many parts are getting to the end of this gold, this soil gold, and it needs to be replenished. And so this learning, but what I say, how I was going to close my talk actually, if I hadn't sort of spent so much long at the beginning, was to reflect on the fact that the Fens does give hope, I think, in one sense. While I'm not, an expert like you are in the actual detail of this, what I find inspiring about the Fens is that it's always been a changing landscape. In a sense, that's at its essence. And how people have always had to learn to live with the waters, have always had to adapt and change. This idea that traditional culture is somehow fixed in time was never the case. In fact, people had to respond to the environment to survive, and then in an area where the water paths would move, the coastline was regularly shifting. This is an area which might provide us a model, in fact, of adaptability. That's at the essence, at the heart the Fens. And so it's not when we're talking about resistance, we're not talking about resistance to a fixed way of being. You know, some people say the biggest change that came with the Roman invasion was the introduction of the metal spade, and that metal spade was used to great effect in the Fens over many centuries before the Stuart kings. And that's what I'd say, that the Fens, the part that special part of the world, its very essence is adaptability. And so, you know, there are the people working there, like in the Great Fen Project, which involves farmers, it involves scientists, involves looking into traditional land use patterns, involves the government authorities. It's, you know, that sort of work's really inspiring. You know, that's the urgent task. Yeah.
Keith Sands had a question about the Cambridge colleges. Keith, do you want to ask that? Because of course they're one of the big landholders here and developers, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious, really, with the. I think Cambridge colleges still have quite a lot of power around Cambridge, which is where I live. And I was just interested, as big landowners in the area, far beyond Cambridge and probably in the Fens, I was wondering if they had any particular role in the enclosures and the drainage and the sort of dispossession of Fenlanders, really, of their common rights.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about it in particular, but yeah, the answer is yes, including on both sides. I think I do write in the book about one case where the Cambridge colleges actually held up an enclosure, one of the Cambridge colleges. As I say, it wasn't it wasn't always, not all the commoners were poor, and some of the common rights were enjoyed by relatively wealthy people. Quite high taxes and just could be flowing to the, you know, and compensation had to be paid as part of enclosure. The problem was that the sort of customary commoners, you know, the local villagers who, the local poor who had customary rights, these are often not recognised, but the more wealthy common rights are, and so it could be on both sides, but they were, I mean, as far as I know, unsurprisingly, I don't know of a case where they were the actual proponent of enclosure. They were actually, I don't know of one of them. I imagine there would be those cases. I do know that some of them received payouts, and, you know, as one of the more wealthy participants in that process, would hold it up and resist it in Parliament until, you know, larger sums were paid and so on. I don't know of a case where they speak up to the villagers and are really on their side or anything. But again, I haven't done a lot of work specifically on that, and I don't know if anybody has. Yeah, it should be done. I mean, that would be a good thing for the university to do, wouldn't it? It's part of facing up to the truth of our past. You know, that's not just about facing up to the truth of our past in terms of implications in empire and in slavery and etc. It's also locally, you know, what and the involvement in enclosure and the consequences of that for local people, I think, should be part of the University of Cambridge and the different colleges looking at that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope it can be done.
Matt had a question about naming. Matt.
Oh, yes. Naming is always very interesting.
Hi, James, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. Hi, Matt.
I loved your book and I took a lot from your talk, so thank you very much. Just a question about the naming of the Fenish, and I just wondered whether you had any hesitation about using an identity label that, as far as I know, they wouldn't have used themselves.
Yes, oh yes, I very much did. Very arrogant, isn't it? I had a struggle with this, Matt. Like, it's true that they wouldn't have used it themselves, but that's true, of course, of almost all Indigenous or traditional peoples around the world. You know, like obviously Aboriginal people here didn't have a sort of collective sense. I mean, their relationship with the local people, even Tasmanian Aboriginal people, didn't have any collective sense of them all. Their loyalty is within their local groups, and of course with traditional peoples, your primary loyalty is local, you know, and much more local than the whole region of the Fens. But there were words used by outsiders, understood that the people of the Fens had a sort of shared way of life, a sort of similar culture, a similar identity. And when resistance starts, is the same with Indigenous people in other parts of the empire. It's through resistance and fight where there's a common external enemy that a common identity starts to emerge. You know, you realise that, and the people of the Fens did have an idea of uplanders, you know, people who were, there was a sort of an idea of people, some sense of communal identity, but especially once the fight begins in the late, you know, in the 17th and 18th century, there is starting to, you know, sort of there is a sense of some shared identity there as well. And you get in the literature, people start through to the present day, different terms to describe this identity. Fen men is the most common, and obviously that's very limited today, excluding, you know, half of the population. Fenlander is used, which is, I mean, I use people of the Fens. My struggle with all these words was that it doesn't also describe, it only describes the people, not the way of life or the culture. So when I'm wanting to describe sort of similar mindset or some similar customs, what was the word to use? And so I do describe it. I mean, it's a bit impertinent for me to develop this word Fenish, but that they don't use themselves, or that, you know, other historians aren't using. But it was really because of the lack of any other one to use to describe that shared identity. And in terms of not using it themselves, I'm probably because of the process of you know, it's a bit, most identities of traditional peoples, as I said at the beginning, that is true until it's the process of colonisation, in a sense, the process of outside threat that a shared identity is created through. You know, so the point today, people have, of course, multiple identities, as we well understand. So the people of the Fens today do have an understanding that, you know, they're from the Fens, but they also have ties to local villages, to counties, and of course these days strongly to nation states. People have varying communal identities, not one or the other. But you know, I try to explain it in the book, but it was a sort of a big call to make. But I thought, oh well, it was making it hard to write, literally, Matt, without a word I could use. So my apologies for that, but that's my explanation for it. And it made the book. It meant that I could write about something that was definitely real and there without using gender-specific language.
Thanks, James. Paola's back on the line. So Paola, do you want to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello,
hi,
yes.
Hi, James.
Hello, Paula. Nice to meet you as well.
Nice to meet you.
I'm meeting all my email friends.
So I had a question. I'm a teacher, and I had a question about using your book in the classroom, and I was interested as to your opinion on a balance sheet approach to teaching the agricultural revolution. You know, is it fair or okay to say, well, on the one hand, agricultural, produce increased, food production increased, that powered the industrial revolution, because in a curriculum you want to make links between agricultural revolution and rural protest to other parts of your curriculum. So on the one hand, there were benefits, but on the other hand, it led to the destruction of the Fenish way of life, as did enclosure. It led to the destruction of commoners' way of life. So, how could you, is that balance sheet approach okay in the classroom, and how would you like to see teachers, making use of real research?
I think the main thing, Paula, on that would be to acknowledge uncertainty, especially these days. I mean, going back to Joan Thirsk, who I mentioned before, I mean, her work even in the 1950s was demonstrating that the old fen was far more productive than had been assumed. So it's important that we don't just take for granted the idea that output increased through enclosure. It varies around the country, and the data on that is often very incomplete. It's a claim made very loudly by the agricultural improvers and enclosers, but of course they have a self-benefit involved. It's certainly more easily integrated into the market, the modern market system. But in terms of actual wealth being produced, like actual the resources of the old, and especially in the fen, which was such a rich, so full of natural resources, it's by no means straightforward. So all I'd say is that some of that empirical uncertainty should be acknowledged. We shouldn't take at face value that this was just a case of, oh yeah, we lost a lot of the old. It was sad that we lost the traditional way of life. It's sad that the commoners lost, a lot of the poor people missed out, etc., etc. But overall, this was essential to the creation of the modern economy. It allowed the feeding of the cities. It allowed the development of the industrial economy because it increased agricultural output. We shouldn't take that just on face value. The productivity of the old fen is being radically underestimated by those who sought to enclose it, and so that's. I mean, I wouldn't probably come down on. I would name up the uncertainties about that we actually don't know how that balance sheet would emerge. But we could certainly, I would name up that this was how it was justified. This was how it was argued for. This was, and on the other side, this is what the other side were arguing for, was loss, Yeah. Does that sort of answer the question? Yeah. Anyway, we can talk more
really
about
helpful.
that later too. Yeah. Really thanks, Paula. Good luck with your work. Paula's doing wonderful work for getting history into primary schools and teaching primary school children about these questions in a sort of serious way, or young high school as well, I think, isn't it, Paula? But anyway, it's so exciting and important. Yeah.
That's great, Paula. Keep in touch with Friends of the Cam. Terry had a question. It was quite a direct question early on. Terry, do you want to ask your question about companionship and communication?
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating talk, James, and it's a terrific book which I've just finished. And your talk today raises so many questions. I could ask you questions all evening. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I'm kind of trained to ask questions, but I shall keep it short. But just riffing off what you were just saying then about the way productivity in the fens is hard to estimate when it was common land. I mean, that's a fascinating contrast or analogous to what is happening. One of the big reasons why Friends of the River Cam was set up was because of effectively privatization of the river and the activities of privatized water companies who are over abstracting and shoveling sewage into this river. There's this, despite the fact that they've spent since privatization, the water companies in general in Britain have spent £50 billion on dividends and paybacks to shareholders, and at the same time have clearly massively neglected the infrastructure and are over abstracting the River Cam and are in favour of more development here. So they are a sort of key problem, and their propaganda around privatisation versus how it was under previous ownership is always under debate. Yeah, and equally, if I can just make a very brief comment about your how discombobulated the people of the Fens would be by this, not just the change of ownership, but the change in the whole landscape, the type of agriculture. And I was up in Alaska when Shell was trying to drill wells in the Arctic Ocean in 2015, and visited a place called Barrow, met the Inuit local inhabitants, and who were suffering dreadfully from alcoholism, drug problems, obesity, diabetes, because of this fast forwarding of their traditional lifestyle, trying to come to grips with a new lifestyle that had been forced on them by federal governments, and now face this threat of oil spillages in that area. But just one poignant thing, I said, well, so this place is called Barrow. What does that mean? And they said, oh, that was named after a Royal Navy navigator who came up here and named it after his boss in London. And I said, what did the Inuit call it? And they gave me the word, and the English translation is the area where the snowy owl hunts. And I just thought those two concepts spoke very graphically, very symbolically about this massive discombobulation. So finally, the question I wanted to ask you, you raised this really, really interesting issue very early on when you began, when you talked about how we were kind of divorced and alienated from our history. And you thought, and there was a sort of loneliness that came with that, and how we needed a new form of communication. I wasn't quite clear what you meant by that. Was that with kind of indigenous communities? Was that with the nature that we despoiled? Or what did you mean by that exactly? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, I think I mean, again, I sort of have learnt a lot from, as it sounds like you have, from Indigenous peoples. And one of the things we learn from, Aboriginal people here today is the sort of strength and consolation and wisdom they gather from the past, from the ancestors. It's sort of like the past is also present, not the same sort of idea of time, the same idea of linear time. And it's part of the past becomes part of the present community. And I think they're part of the loneliness, the great loneliness of, we're getting to almost beyond history here, but the loneliness of Western people, which creates this great restlessness in which we remake nature with such fervour and energy and go about in such a sort of restless ferment of activity. Comes from this idea of the individual disconnected from the past, disconnected from each other, and disconnected also from nature, And so what I meant from it was that sometimes when we write environmental history, modern history, in a way that emphasises the destruction that's been caused in the past, and so that we have to sort of just have a totally new way now of beginning again, we cut ourselves off from so much traditional knowledge in our own culture, not just from Indigenous cultures we can learn from our own culture. And in the Fens, some of the land use practices that went on, and then the Great Fen Project is doing this and other projects where they're looking at traditional grazing regimes, traditional sort of the cutting of the rushes at certain times. It's about drawing on knowledge from the past. Obviously, scientific knowledge, modern scientific, it's not, we haven't got the same environment that we had 200 years ago. So it's not just literally applying that. In Australia, we're learning to live with fire, in the Fens are learning to live with water and drawing on traditional Indigenous knowledge about burning regimes and how you live with fire. It's sort of, it's about seeing the past as a source of wisdom and knowledge, as well as a source, and even where we want to reject the past, we need to understand that. And I just find that gives me anyway sort of a community. Yeah. Sorry, so have I lost you? Still there?
Oh, you've got us.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So anyway, look, it's there's opportunities to learn from and there's wisdom there, but there's also, for me anyway, and I hope for you people involved in, you know, in the Friends of the Cam, there can be, Susan said at the beginning, there can be a source of hope and solace and strength in these struggles of the past, and the fact that they've made a difference. You know, that it's not just been a futile, hopeless endeavour, and certainly maintaining hope at the moment, maintaining people's sustenance and strength for, you know, what's a pretty difficult struggle at the moment, is important. And I think there is strength to be found in the past. It's not just a place where all the problems began.
I think that there are two questions that I don't know if the questioners could ask. One was Tony's, about how we relate what you're talking about, James, to the way in which people are being dispossessed of their land and end up on our shores. So that's actually, how do we relate to things happening to people contemporarily? And the other is Dan Carter, who has posted something about the links between slavery and slave money and the enclosure of the Fens. So it's these kind of global networks that are so important. I suspect, Dan, you might have been reading the Book of Trespass, because there's a brilliant chapter in that on enclosures and slavery.
I mean, I thought it was a wonderful talk, so I should say that. Not just a great talk, but also extremely moving and resonant with all sorts of things which we're experiencing, which I kind of feel was a purpose of yours. So, I mean, I wanted to express my appreciation. I thought about your notion of country and as being an attachment to place, and then wondered if, unlike many people's attachment to country, perhaps without the inverted commas, there were people in the Fens who thought, this is my place and it can be your place too. But if you don't dispossess me, I can share with you, which is a kind of inclusive notion of country, which of course is what we have to build.
That's what we need to move to. I think, I mean, for the commons did provide a level of refuge for other dispossessed commoners from other parts of England. You know, the people hitting the road, a lot of hitting the road in the 18th century, who no longer had their own parish. But there was a level of sort of localism, you know, a dark side of localism, I suppose, you know, that could also exclude outsiders. But many people did find, especially, you know, in the Fens, a refuge, and were able to build a new life. I mean, that's true also. But I think that's part of where we need a new way. Our understanding of what country means obviously has a global dimension and needs a global dimension, and needs to be able to understand the you know, in a sense, it is literally true that the planet is now also our village, you know, and this is a very different worldview than the people of the Fens and other traditional peoples had. And part of that is a responsibility that we have to and our sense of connection to others around the planet that they didn't have. I mean, their world, their universe was much smaller geographically than ours, and so that's part of the difference. Our notion of the common is more inclusive, I think, but it still requires management. We need to remember it does require active management. It is about active human beings being involved who are living locally in that area. It is there is a local care for country that's there, but it has the boundaries around who is in and who is out are much more porous now. Yeah. Mm. We're not just the people who are born in it. And, obviously people living in settler countries like mine are very conscious of that. I mean, we're all outsiders in a sense. Yeah. This is our home, but it's also conquered land. It's we live with that sort of ambiguity.
Yes, I sort of have an idea of big country or big England, like as opposed to little England. And in
What's
big, a notion of big England, as opposed to people talk of little England and little England.
Yeah, big, generous-hearted, opening.
Yeah. So if you like the place, you're English.
Yeah, well, that's it, isn't it? It should be about your, if you like the place, but if you also care for, and if you care for the place, you really are. If you care for the people of the place and you care for the land, you care for the non-human life as well, then you're more English than the person who might have had generations but actually doesn't give a stuff for the other people or for the non-human life or for the vulnerable people in the community. I mean, it's about, but that's where I was talking about relationships. I think at the heart of the commons was relationships, a system of relationships with nature and with other people. That is the heart of the commons. It's not actually a system of codified rights. This is my right to hunt, my right to fish, my right to gather fuel, my right, not a set of rights. It's actually a set of relationships and obligations and reciprocal sort of mutuality that went with that. And so that's what we can, that's the bit of the commons I think we want to hold on, really reclaim.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end, actually, because it brings us around full circle. It's where you began, that idea of the area as relationships. And I think that's a really interesting notion for us to build on. Tony, do you want to just tell James something about our Midsummer event? James, you said you might be visiting the UK.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to mention that, Susan, that I'm definitely visiting now with all the relaxation in the UK. It looks like you'll be welcome to people from outsiders, and we're going. So yes, Emma, my wife Emma is English, and coming over to see the family, and I'd love if there was any, I'd love to if anyone has a local event or.
Well, June the 21st, Midsummer Night. Last year we declared the rights of our river. And it would be wonderful if you could join us.
Thank you.
You have a place to stay, certainly in Sue and my house, and I'm sure in many others. So we would welcome you.
Thanks, Tony.
We would welcome you to our little bit of country, whatever it means, with open arms. And it would be delightful if you would share that day with us.
Yeah. So everyone on the call is very welcome to the Midsummer celebration. So do keep an eye on our website with future events, and we'll continue the conversation on how we can resist the things that are destroying the area, the social and the ecological area here. So again, James, thank you so much for joining us at this early hour and for sharing your thoughts and ideas. And those who haven't read the book, I'm sure will be rushing out to get it. I can certainly recommend it as a brilliant read.
Thank you, Susan. And as I say, don't worry about Thursday. It's a beautiful day on Thursday. Just look forward to it.
Yeah. Right. Until June.
Until June. See you. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye, Tony. Yeah, see you soon.
Yeah, be wonderful.
Thank you.
Tony and I will stay on the Zoom for a few minutes. Thanks so much for coming.
Really enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Could I just say directly to the committee, thank you very much indeed for the chance to be with you this evening, as some of the other members of the Safe Honey Hill group are as well. It just seems also relevant, the sewage work, the next launch of a consultation about Anglian water actually happening tomorrow. And this is, you know, it's put a bit of fibre into my being, ready to fight the fight all over again. Thanks very much.
Oh, good luck.
One thing I wanted to ask about was about direct action and sabotage. I mean, which we didn't mention that. Of course, the Fenlanders didn't try and stop enclosure by kind of writing letters and having meetings. They actually took, you know, pickaxes to the drainage machinery.
I think there were quite a lot of things went on. My understanding, in fact, I don't know if anybody else has come across it because I can't get the exact reference clear. But I think up around Soham, they went to court and they fought hard against. This is one of the later enclosures, actually, early 19th century, and they fought very hard for their rights. The comment I came across was you can still see the outline of the Saxon field strip systems because the land wasn't consolidated and reorganised, because the Soham commoners actually got the court to rescind some of the enclosures. Direct action is one thing, but actually winning its appeal in court is another way of approaching it.
I worked in Soham for many years, and so there is something I read about it a while back. Soham still has an awful lot of common land compared to other villages. The grazing rights within Soham are still an enormous amount of common land, both either sides of the river. It's never quite been enclosed. Just thought you'd like to know that.
How come? Do you know why, Ivan?
I can't say for certain. I worked there for a number of years. They still have a commons pender in Soham who looks after the various aspects of and a reeve, which are the traditional people that looked after the common land. It's been that way for as long as I can remember, but there are vast areas of Soham, both East Fen Common, Quar Fen Common and Angle Common, which are large swathes of land which are in common ownership, and the grazing rights are still used by commoners. Horses, cattle are still grazed on those commons, frequently seen. But, thank you for a very interesting discussion, by the way.
Yes, thank you. I was just saying to say thank you. I'm Finnish and I have learnt to love the Fens over my lifetime, and I found the talk and discussion fascinating, and I'm certainly one who's ordered the book.
Great.
And I look forward to reading it. So thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
See you at Midsummer.
Of course.
If I may add, around that week, I believe it's Celebrate the Fens. That's around that time, and she's asking for organisations. And last year there was Poland Abbey involved, and it stretched far, and Great Fen and all this sort of yeah.
Great.
Okay.
And it's the weekend before the solstice.
So I gather there's a move. There has been a move to try and stop the grazing of cattle on the common land in Cambridge. You heard about that?
Yeah.
And it just seems that's been a common right for hundreds of years. I thought that was really, really very interesting evening. Thank you very much for organising.
Good.